It's not in the face! Thank you.
Hello and welcome to Hey, Not the Face with your host, John Nash, and your producer, me, Steffi Haynes. And today we have a very special episode for you. We have Luke Thomas with us, very esteemed journalist, has his own Substack now of morning combat fame. Luke, thank you so much for joining us. How are you?
Doing great, and thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Yes. We have been looking forward to this all week. I'm excited. The way it's going to work for our listeners out there, I'm going to do my normal. I'm going to bring in the question. We're going to have Luke answer, and then John's going to weigh in, and they're going to converse, and then we'll move on to the next topic. So without any further ado, let's get started. So, Luke, how has your opinion regarding the MMA industry changed during your career covering MMA? Have they changed very little, your opinions? Do you hold very different positions than you did back when you first started at Bloody Elbow?
Boy, that's a big question.
Yeah, I'm just going to take a big break over here while you answer that one.
No, I mean, I can simplify it. I mean, what I would say is, the industry has changed so much during that time. I don't know how the opinions couldn't. And as I've moved through it, I've been in different places in my life and different places in my career. So again, just through the natural process of living through a momentous time in the sports history, for sure, my opinion has changed in innumerable ways. I would say that it has, if you're asking like the overall trajectory of positivity, that has certainly declined, in part because of, I'm in a different place in my life, partly. I don't think the sport is quite as interesting as it once was, although I'm not as down on it as other people. I recognize that the complaints that are out there about card quality and or fighter quality are not without merit, and I share many of them. Nevertheless, it's not uniformly bad in every kind of way. And in fact, what's kind of interesting is, again, we don't even have time to get to it, but the proliferation of other combat sports, like they're all available on streaming. Like in many ways, there are still a lot of things that are relative to how I began much, much better. But I think I see it more nakedly for what it is now in terms of power structures, in terms of, who comprises the sport and in its various roles. And, again, it's not uniformly souring. That's not really the point. But maybe I'll put it this way. I think I see it more clearly for what it is now relative to me at 20 something, having, this kind of romanticized view of what it all was.
And well, for me, the weird part is for the stuff we cover in the shows, we focus on business and stuff. That part has changed very little for me from when I first started watching, I guess over 20 years ago now, over 20 years ago. The part that's changed is the stuff I don't cover is I didn't realize that I think the most entertaining form of mixed martial arts would have been when it's not as polished, that there were still questions arising about best practices and mixing having schools that hadn't yet figured out how to tackle other schools and in finding out which martial art, that some people were limited in their training and limited martial arts, and then they would go meet someone else. That's the part that I think I really missed the boat on, that answering the questions might take away some of the joy that I had for the sport. But the business stuff, I looked at some of my old comments and articles, and I'm maybe that's a bad sign that I haven't changed, but I have a lot of the same opinions from back in 2008, 2009.
No, I don't think it's a bad thing. I mean, it's lamentable maybe that there hasn't been the need to update, right? I mean, that's sort of the difference. Whereas what you're describing as the proliferation of defense and best practices have kind of neutered MMA to a degree. That's a little bit overstated, but that definitely has changed it. But, as someone a little bit in the weeds on technique, I mean, I'm not there's a million to do it much better than me, but I tinker with it, I suppose. And there's still a lot of stuff to enjoy, but I wonder if people aren't tinkering and then making that effort if it is as readily available as it once was. It used to be much more nakedly visible, and now you have to kind of, find that record at the flea market a little bit, right?
Yeah. Well, not to beat this subject in the ground, because it doesn't. Again, our theme is usually business, but not to go back to also the Pride area, which I think we have rose-colored glasses. We look at Pride, but you look at guys with like Rampage, met Shogun, and all the fighters back then, is that their training, they were cross-training. They were making huge strides, but it's like they were using Muay Thai mixed with some Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu against a guy that practiced boxing with American wrestling. The camps and stuff hadn't like incorporated all the different elements and figured out what worked against what. So you have these just wildly different reactions to certain strategies and tactics that you don't, because we've seen so much stuff thrown together, I think lately in the last, since then, that you don't get guys caught in the Muay Thai plum and beaten to death like you did back then, where certain things would come up and people would have a hard time how to adjust to that, because they came from a school where or training camp where they had no one really that had the experience that those guys in another training camp had.
Also, if I can just add, I mean, I kind of now that it's all sort of out in the open, it's not surprising that the sport, I think even without what UFC has done, would lean to the right. And it's not a question of like, I thought everyone was one thing and it went the other, but like the degree to which it has come to define the sport's, relationship to the public, or the degree to which the MMA, the degree to which the sport is known for being like, fitness is kind of what they call right coded, where it's not explicitly right wing, but it is like the online influencer world is typically, and then the strength athletes and all the ones who have like YouTube channels, these are all like nominally right wing guys for the most part, but it's not explicitly stated. And in UFC, it's like it's explicit. You know what I mean? It's explicit, and that definitely has been a big change to get used to, for sure.
Yeah, I gotta be honest, I didn't see that coming. How right wing MMA would be coded. I thought it leaned right, but I didn't think it'd be like lock, stock, and barrel as viewed as a right wing entity.
Yeah, so I don't have much to add beyond that, but these are like the big strokes that, and also maybe I'll add one more piece here, which is, MMA media has had a weird journey where these, like when I first tried to get into it, the jobs basically didn't exist. I mean, there was Sherdog to a degree. There was a couple of small roles, maybe MMA Weekly, Full Contact Fighter. These are some real old school joints. And the goal at my generation, the goal was, hey, let's convince all these major media companies to cover MMA and then like hire us for jobs. Let's get the media organs that we know of, and then in the aughts, or excuse me, I should say the 2010s, the new ones emerging, let's get them to cover MMA. And that worked for a real long time, but those both legacy and new media are in free fall. And that has just, I don't think it's made a media better by any stretch, but it has certainly changed it significantly. And trying to navigate that, particularly this later chapter of it, has been surprising to me. I didn't realize just how bad it was for all. I mean, you did know how bad it was for all of media, but it was just funny. Those jobs in corporate media, they lasted about 15 years. And I don't know how much longer they're going to last, but like even just the notion of a website being relevant as a news serving interface, I think is, I don't think it'll ever go away necessarily, but it's definitely going to decline even further. And like with it is going to take even more jobs. So strange times on that front too.
We had another question set up to immediately follow the first one, but I'm going to skip ahead because you touched on the media. So I'm going to go ahead and ask our media question, which is, what do you think about the very precipitous drop-off in MMA journalism? And do you think that its loss has had a major impact on MMA?
Ooh, these are big. Boy, you guys came with the heaters today, huh? Unbelievable. So I would say that, what do I think about it? I'm of two different minds. I mean, again, I partly already related. It's kind of like the nuts and bolts of like the life cycle of MMA media. But the two minds would be, on the one hand, obviously, like anybody losing their job is, there's never a thing to celebrate. That just would be never where I would go. But I guess what I would say is there's just no way to look at the way in which MMA media has I mean, they had an impossible task. And people don't realize this, but I think it's really true. Now, that isn't to say that you couldn't individually do better than what the circumstances you inherited are, but it's really true. On the one hand, you could go adversarial, and the nature of the industry would make making money that way not impossible, but for most, it's going to make it really, really challenging, either to sell ads on a website or to gain access enough to produce the relevant kinds of content that audiences respond to. It's just a very, very difficult road to walk down. On the other side, you can be totally obsequious, and that will enable you to remain within the good graces of different kinds of power circles. But it ultimately neuters your coverage in such a way that you become very expendable over time, that you don't actually provide the relevant kind of coverage that matters, because it is such an editorially walled off garden that, you just can't produce good fruit or vegetables there, to strain the metaphor. And that's kind of what's happened to it. And one way or the other. And now, and then the broader picture is, of course, journalism as a business. It was always, I mean, for those of us who came up in newspapers and then watched what Craigslist did, and then watched the venture capital money come in circa 2010 with a very basic promise. And the promise was, we don't really know how to make money off of journalism on the internet, but give us a few years and we're going to figure it out. And the reality is they couldn't. There are certain examples examples that prove the rule. There are going to be exceptions. But, New York Times making money off of recipes and games and nothing else kind of gives the game away. Washington Post in 2023 lost $100 million just that year. They don't really know how to make money off of this stuff. And so in that broader consideration, and then the micro one relative to how to deal with the 800-pound gorilla in the room in the UFC, you basically saw entities go one way or the other, and one might survive a little longer than the other, but it doesn't seem like either are headed for more fertile ground. Journalism itself and media content itself is becoming harder to make valuable use out of, and here we are.
If I may, I would like to add a little bit further, thoughts on influencer media, and then also the introduction of AI-powered media.
So I don't have much to say about AI-powered media, because I don't think I'm not one of these guys who's like, oh, they'll never make use of it. They might make use of it within 6 months. But as it stands to this point of this conversation, there's AI stuff for like written media, but it's all real bad. It's not very good. You can't really, no one, like, who out there is using in a genuine way AI to make not just a buck off of some kind of scam, but to produce like quality content that people rally around. It doesn't exist, not in MMA anyway. For news media coverage. But on the influencer side, man, the influencer side is they are the inevitable result of the fact that journalism, like pissing off powerful people, is not great for making money. So what if you could get people who don't even have the pretense of doing something like that, but may or may not, for whatever relevant community, have an interesting identity, like a public facing identity. They can amass huge audiences, as I mentioned, no pretense of journalism, and it just seems like the audience, and this is not going to be true universally, but it seems like the broad strokes of the audience are they don't really care or seem to distinguish much from that versus journalism. If that's the case, like how do you do journalism? How do you do journalism in a world where people can get bigger audiences with you and not even bother with the pretense of it? And you can see why that would be popular for people who are very, very interested in controlling the message of what gets said about them.
I think it's safe to say that everyone here thinks that the UFC is a monopoly. Besides fighter pay, what do you think is the biggest problem in MMA that the UFC's monopoly is causing?
Man, that's it. I would say that there can't be an economy within the sport absent the UFC's hand. It's very, very, very difficult I mean, just think about it logically. It doesn't really matter who you are, media member, promoter, manager, fighter. If you said, okay, not even in some kind of angry way, but maybe like an experimental way, I'm going to see how far I can take my career and never, ever get the approval of the UFC for anything. And again, there are certain ways you could do that and actually do quite well. But the number of people who do that are going to be very, very limited. If you're a manager and you're just saying, I'm not going to do business with UFC, that's going to limit what you can do. If you're a media person and you're like, media, it's a little bit easier, but I'm not going to do it with any relationship to the UFC whatsoever. That's just a more difficult task than the trying to go a more credentialed in terms of what they can offer route. And if you're a fighter, what your upside on what you can make is going to be. I mean, it's just inherently and not just limited, but like it's almost, again, with some exception, it's going to be like all or nothing. And it doesn't necessarily need to be that way. You could still have the UFC as like the dominant force in the sport, but that there could be some kind of an economy. And even if you're like a promoter on the regional scene, how are you going to get televised? Well, if you have a Fight Pass deal, that's going to be easier than most. Well, in order to get a Fight Pass deal, I'm going to guess, maybe you don't have to be best friends with the UFC, but you certainly can't be at odds with them, or in the theoretical situation that I envisioned, declaring that you just won't do business with them, right? Whatever that may be. It's just very, very difficult to do that. And I think as a consequence, what's ended up happening is whatever the UFC wants MMA to be, it will be. Like if any firm in any market has the relationship to that market, the way in which the UFC has it, which is like, not total control, but near total control, the way in which it defines the sport will bleed all the way through. And so as a consequence, it's not just that you can't have this economy beyond the UFC's vision of things. It's that it creates a monoculture all the way down. It's people are talking about the same people. They like the same podcasts. They have the same, in this particular case now, the same political views. And like the identarian way of thinking about that, it goes all the way up and down everything that they touch. And that's in large part because of the way in which the UFC has control and then has exerted it. And MMA, for folks who remember how it used to be, was the opposite of monoculture. It was oddball culture it was like going to Comic-Con, where you have all the little weirdos who, and I love Comic-Con. I'm saying weirdos, in a not in a pejorative way, but all the different subgroups that you would get, and they're all somewhat related, somewhat different, but you're all kind of held by this common bond of we all want to be at Comic-Con. It used to be like that. Now everything is just the Marvel booth. Right now, everything is just, whatever. That kind of thing has been taken largely out of it with some exception here or there. I think losing that has not been great for the sport.
For the folks out there listening, if you're wondering why John has not been on the conversation, his power dropped out. And now that it's back, he's having the devil of a time getting his laptop back online. So Luke and I are going to continue the conversation until John gets it worked out or until Luke and I are done. So next question, sir, is what is the one thing about the entire fighter pay story that surprises you the most?
The thing that's most surprising to me is that the fighters are basically accepting of their reality. Now, parts of that are not surprising and, in fact, quite understandable. For example, individually, a fighter, maybe doesn't know much about unionization, and maybe in the course of their experience, it wasn't explained to them very well, and they didn't understand, and they had some concerns about it. I think that's regrettable, but I think, to the extent that that's an honest place at which they're arriving to make a decision, again, it's regrettable, but I can understand that. Conversely, if you're just looking more broadly, you're like, look, man, I don't have a long time to make money. I'm not going to rock the boat. I'm just going to kind of go along with it. Again, on some broader sense, I understand that. But I think the thing that's been kind of interesting to me is, one, on the more negative end, fighters coming out and like going to the mat for UFC pay has been surprising. And then, in the way in which they're doing it, like justifying this kind of, doing like this kind of labor coercion as a sign of virtue. Right? Here's what I mean. Like, you only make the big bucks if you absolutely deserve it, even if it's the worst. You're entitled to the worst circumstances. You're entitled to the worst uphill climb, and if you can overcome that, on that very, this kind of, they treat it like a majestic ascent to the top of Kilimanjaro, right? Like the people who reach the top of Kilimanjaro, like they can get the money, but everybody else doesn't, and it's just a real way of coercing labor. And it's not much more complicated than that. The fact that they are active participants in that kind of effort when they're the victims of it is surprising. It's one thing, for somebody who's got something to get out of it to do labor coercion, but not for the labor itself. That was surprising. And I think the other part too is not even that, just how many instances have to go by where absolutely nothing is done, where, hey, I nominally agree with these views, but I'm a little bit afraid to do anything about it. It's like, if you get a bunch of chances to weigh in and you don't weigh in on any of them, I don't really believe that you care. Like, I can understand, hey, I'm going to let a lot of I got to pick my battles, blah, blah, blah. Hey, I don't want to be that guy that's out there doing angry interviews about my pay. But if a chance comes up for unionization, I'm going to sign my card, that kind of a thing. But it's usually the opposite. Like, what I can't stand, this has been something that's really bothered me over the years, is like, fighters will say nothing about their pay and, they'll go quiet and never do anything, and then complain to me, privately after the fact. And it's like, I don't know what you want me to do about this. Did you sign your union card? And like, this was at a time when that conversation was relevant. It's obviously not relevant right now. And the majority of them would say no. And they'd be like, well, what do you want me to, what do you want me to say? Like, what do you want me to say? Like, I can't fix this for you. And if you don't want to do anything and you've been given repeated efforts to do something about it, I'm sorry, I just don't really believe you care. Maybe that's unfair. I don't know, but that's kind of where I'm at. And, I don't know if that interpretation is correct, Steffi, but I will tell you that is how I've kind of learned to process all of it. That part has been very surprising to me.
How about the mainstream coverage or lack thereof about, the fighter pay story?
I wish John was back on the call, because I think he'd have a little bit more to offer here as someone who's like intensely focused on that issue. I mean, a couple things. Like, a story doesn't get big from within MMA until the MMA media rallies enough around it that it kind of bubbles up to the surface. And over time, the coverage that fighter pay has gotten has in fact bubbled to the surface. But because MMA media inherently is not good about covering pay, it has been uneven, and it's just not treated as any, certainly anymore, it's not treated as any kind of scandal. It's not treated as any kind of like urgent matter. And so, you just didn't get the same kind of upward push that normally fuels these media cycles. So that's the first thing I'd say. I think the second thing, go ahead.
I'm sorry. I just wanted to interject. Were you disappointed that it took so long to bubble to the surface? Because it took years.
I mean, you would always want these things to go better than they went. But I will tell you that, like, I think this is something I've picked up on recently, but I think has been true. Oh, man, this is such an okay. This is something I've been really rattling around my head. All right. Mm-hmm. I know we'll probably talk about potentially a repeal or amendment or whatever, however they're going to treat the Ali Act. But one thing, like, I was trying to explain to someone, the reason why, like, the legislative process is very, very difficult, and it is difficult to predict. And there are lots of ways that TKO could try and fail. However, one thing that is clearly going in their favor is that in previous instances when Zuffa or the UFC wanted to affect change on Capitol Hill, they would hire a PR firm, a lobbying firm with PR capabilities. They did this when McCain tried to get amendments, or I should say updates to the Ali Act circa 2007, and in other cases as well. And you would imagine that if they would want to get this legislation passed, they are going to have probably some kind of PR effort, some kind of lobbying effort on the Hill. They're going to get, powerful senators to, at a bare minimum, try and push this stuff through on their behalf. I've also heard the Ted Cruz thing. That's not just Eric McGracken. I've heard that as well. So again, we'll see what happens, but I suspect there will be, the point I'm trying to make is there's going to be a formal legislative effort to get this done. Who is the coordinated campaign on the side of protecting the Ali Act? Right? You've got this gigantic corporation that has a monopoly basically in two different industries that is streamlined, well-funded. They've got legislative connections. They've got, a lot of money to pour into a PR campaign. Like, that's a coordinated legislative effort. That's typically how the Hill works. But if there's legislation that they're trying to pass to, I'll make up something, completely turn into socialized medicine, you would imagine that on the other side, there would be a similar kind of effort. There would be constituency groups, various other lobbying and PR firms hired to do the opposite bidding. And my point is, like, legislatively, who on the boxing side represents that to protect the Ali Act as a legislative on the Hill kind of presence? And the answer is it doesn't exist. And for that reason alone, TKO is almost running this unopposed. Again, that's not quite right, but you get my point. But what I'm trying to point out to you about all of this is, part of the reason why they're going to be, I think, potentially effective in passing this legislation is boxing has just been the absolute whipping post of the redheaded stepchild of sports, such that it has become synonymous with sports dysfunction. And one of the hard lessons that I had to learn was, like, yes, boxing is very dysfunctional. That's not an unfair thing, but it was designed that way. Like, it wasn't designed for maximum sporting efficiency. No one would look at the belt system and go, this is obviously the smoothest way to do it. But it is done to curb or limit abuses by bad actors, because the kinds of people who are interested in boxing historically have been those kinds of people. And it's very difficult to make the argument to people that boxing is actually not well run, but that the protections that exist are actually very, very critical to protecting vulnerable populations. I got a little bit wandered on my question. Can you repeat the follow-up that you had asked?
Just that if you were disappointed with the fact that the media took so long to get
Okay, yes. Sorry. So yes. So the point I'm trying to make is, with all of this, is you're not just fighting a battle about, hey, we think these guys are underpaid. You're fighting a battle, because it was set much before that, about boxing's dysfunction, because Dana White had pitched the UFC's identity as the antidote to boxing, as the thing that is correcting for its excesses, its abuses, its mistakes. And in certain respects, for a time, that was actually quite correct. Or, not universally, but in certain ways, it was quite correct. And so the point I'm trying to make is, when you're asking people to understand that MMA fighters don't make enough money, and then you point to, like, boxers and they make a lot, people, like, now it's kind of beginning to dawn on them that there's a reason that this has happened. But it was an uphill climb, because nothing about the way boxing functioned could be seen as what you would laud as, an exemplary way of doing. But you're fighting this in gigantic context of dysfunction as a brand, excess as a brand, greed as a brand. And MMA was presented as this antidote. You had to overcome all of that just to get to a point where you could have an honest conversation about how should this work. So I will tell you, no, I think a lot of people had to get convinced the hard way on this one. And that's not a referendum on the worthiness of the story. It's a referendum on the context in which the story exists. And that was a long ass answer, but I hope that helps.
It certainly does. I love the answer, by the way. Next question. What would be your number one solution for solving fighter pay And how unhappy would some in the industry be with the consequences of that solution?
Number one solution.
To access the bonus content of this episode, you must be a paid subscriber. To do that, go to heynottheface.substack.com and subscribe today.
Ow! Ow! Not the face! Ooh! Ooh! Okay, the face!